Welcome to the Low Carb MD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome back to the Low Carb MD podcast. Tro, we have someone that's really smart and has a cool accent too. We're lucky today, right?
No, we have.
I'm working on my accent just so I can sound smarter. Maybe I need a class.
So we got Graham Phillips here today. He is a registered pharmacist in the UK, a fellow of the Royal Pharmaceutical Society. He's the owner of iHeart Pharmacy Group. It's several pharmacies out in the UK, an award-winning pharmacy group, and he is on the board of the Public Health Collaboration, and he is also the owner and operator of Prolongevity, which is a podcast, so go check that out if you haven't, and also a service to reverse metabolic disease. So and we got a chance to meet, and I just constantly impressed. I came on his podcast a number of months ago. We met in Low Carb Denver, and just a great guy. So happy to have you here, Graham Phillips.
No, thanks very much. I kind of feel like we're brothers now since our sort of, our meeting in Denver. And it's so good to see you, Brian. I've listened to many of the podcasts. So it's great that we've had the opportunity all to meet up finally, even if it's virtually. Maybe next time it'll be in person.
Absolutely. So great to have you on. So tell us about all the stuff you're doing so we can catch up on this side of the pond a little bit.
Yeah. So like you guys, right, I was conventionally trained. And I started life as a fat kid and became a fat adult. And the fatter I got, the hungrier I got, and the hungrier I got, the fatter I got. And I was following all the guidelines. And I knew, pharmacists have a very, very scientific training. We don't have the clinical training the doctors have, but we're very scientific. We know about mitochondria and cell membranes and drug action and all of that stuff. And we're very, very good at following guidelines, right? I think the criticism of my profession, I would say, is we're too good at following guidelines, sometimes, to the patient's deficit. And if I was going to criticize my medical colleagues, it would be the other way around, that sometimes they ignore the guidelines and they're, a bit too more free flowing, which kind of is why I think you put the two of us together in a mixer and you've got the perfect health professional. So I qualified, and all I was ever going to do, I had this dream of having my own pharmacy, and I started my first pharmacy in a Roman town called St Albans, originally called Verulamium. And that was going to be my future, right? And I absolutely loved it. I built a huge connection with local people. I was there, from dawn to dusk every day, as kind of independent pharmacists tend to be. And I had a fantastic communication with the local people. And because you see people so frequently, and you see women when they're pregnant, and then you see them when they're struggling with their breastfeeding, and then you see them as the kids grow up, and then you see the kids for their contraception and so on. You build this amazing, community pharmacies should be exactly that. So I started with one pharmacy. And at a certain point, I thought, is there more to it than this? And I wanted to develop. And at that point, there wasn't really that much professional development for pharmacists. You were kind of in the shop in a sort of semi-retail environment. There wasn't that much to do. But I went on and did a clinical diploma to enhance my clinical skills, because I was always keen to work with my local GP colleagues, and I very much still am. So we built up a group, and I ultimately ended up with 10 pharmacies. And you guys would know this, right? So by that stage, I'd done lots of work with GPs at the national level, at the local level. I'd been a prescribing advisor. I'd helped, with all the different schemes that we develop. And I'd realized that you can go to a 5 GP practice where you've got 5 partners working in complete synergy, providing fantastic services, enjoying their practice, providing brilliant services to patients, and, happy days. And you could go down the road to another 5-partner practice of a similar size. And what you actually had was 5 individuals practice who hated each other, who couldn't communicate, with no synergy, and everyone was miserable, and the patients had a pretty miserable time, right? And by that stage, of course, communications, but, when I started, there was no internet, right? We used to type the labels. I never hand wrote the labels. We used to type them. I realized once you've got internet connectivity, a group practice can be in the same building, or it can be quite widely spread. So long as you can communicate well with each other, you don't need to be in the same building. You just need to be in the same professional headspace. So I reinvented, by then we had 10 pharmacies. I reinvented our pharmacies as a group practice of pharmacies based on what I thought was the best of general practice medicine. And it was a complete rethink. So we would support each other, we were research active, we would do new stuff. And it was great for a while. And I won all these awards. And I became very senior in my profession. I was we have various national bodies. I was elected to most of those, re-elected to most of those. So you kind of think, well, at that point, what could possibly go wrong? I'll tell you what will go wrong. I looked around me and I thought, you know what? I'm spooning more and more tablets into people. The drugs bill's getting ever higher, and the people are getting ever sicker, and I'm getting hungrier and fatter, and some of this doesn't work out. So, I reached a certain point and I had my own health journey, which is I discovered inadvertently, I started off with intermittent fasting and immediately lost 10 kilos and felt much better. And I thought, hang about, calories in, calories out, none of the maths works. So maybe it isn't. And I started to re-explore the whole world. And I was just really lucky. I bumped into the public health collaboration. I bumped into David Unwin on Twitter, and I became involved in that. And I thought, let's reinvent, what you were talking about, reinventing medicine, Tro. And one of your, I think in your Denver presentation, you talked about it. And I want to see, I completely agree with you. Let's reinvent medicine, but equally, let's reinvent pharmacy. Because it doesn't have to be a living based on how many prescriptions you dispense and how many statins you spoon into people. It could equally, if we were paid in the right way, it'd be about how many people you de-prescribe for, and I'm very interested in de-prescribing, and adding much more value. How many people's metabolic syndrome did you not only reverse but prevent? So that was kind of the thinking. And then my first client was a guy called Jeremy, and I can talk about Jeremy because he's on my website, so I'm not betraying any patient confidentiality. And this was when CGM started to become available. And I'd known Jeremy, like we've been friends for like 30 years. He was in his 50s by that stage. I'd known him in his late 20s. And an ostensibly reasonably healthy and very successful guy with an engineering degree. And I said to Jem, why don't we have a go with a CGM? Now, Jeremy wasn't particularly overweight, but he had this monstrous hypertension. And Jeremy being Jeremy, seeing a mere family physician was never going to be enough. So he was going to see one of the country's leading cardiologists. And he'd been seeing this cardiologist for 20 years, right? And you'll be very familiar with this pattern. With each review, there'll be another dose of another drug and another dose, and each year, inexorably, the medical burden went up, the number of drugs and doses went up, and he was now on his 5th drug. And yes, it was controlling his blood pressure, but he wasn't feeling great. So I said, look, Jem, with your background in engineering, you'll love a CGM. So we plonked the CGM on him. Next morning, huge blood glucose spike, right? So I sent him a WhatsApp, what did you have for breakfast? And he said, all brown. So I wrote back to him and said, Jem, that is just sugar. So he said, what the hell do I have for breakfast? So I said, well, have an omelette, have a cheese omelette one day, an avocado omelette. And so it went on, right? Within a month, without any dieting, he lost 5 kilos. And he was still taking all these meds, so his blood pressure was in its boots. So he said, well, what do I do? I said, well, I could do a medicines review for you, Jem, but you've been seeing this cardiologist, go back and see him. So by the time he got, my numbers might be slightly out, but by the time he'd gone, it was about 12 weeks before he'd gone back to see the cardiologist, got the appointment, by which time he'd lost 12 kilos. And without dieting, right? He just changed what he ate, probably eating more calories. Cardiologist said to him, I've never seen anything like this in my entire professional life. Immediately halved his medication, right? So after 20 years of increasing medication, it was halved overnight. We're now like 5 years on. Jeremy's 23 kilos lighter. And the only drug, as far as I know, he's still taking is a statin. And that's because I can't convince him he doesn't need it. So that was the beginning of my journey. And then well, n equals 1. I'm a scientist. I know that n equals 1 means nothing except you're the n equals 1, right? That's not evidence. That's just anecdote. So I thought, okay, well, let's try it with a few more people and a few more people and a few, and I kept getting these results that were unbelievable. The results that were much better than I ever got with the drugs. And I tell you what, much more satisfying professionally than anything I'd ever done in pharmacy, despite all the awards I'd won. And from that was born the Prolongevity program. So that's a very long answer to a short question. I apologize.
No, I mean, so
I love it. I keep hearing Dr. Unwin, like, it just sounds like that. Let's try this, see what happens. And then they get better. And then the next person gets better. You think, how can this possibly be happening? Right, Terrell?
Yeah.
I mean, you discounted the n equals 1, but, I would say a lot of science starts there, right? A lot of science starts with that n equals 1. I think the stereotypic, all those, from washing hands to H. pylori, right? These huge, so don't discount that n equals 1, but then you were skeptical.
Well, we have to be, don't we? Because everyone's heard a story tale of a witch doctor who's had one remark. There's loads of bullshit, and how do you tell the charlatans from the health professionals, the genuine health professionals, right?
You know how I do? It's someone like you who says, look, I make more money on giving you more drugs. And if I'm taking you off drugs and I'm taking joy in that, then I'm hurting my own income to a degree, right?
Yeah.
When I started hearing about people, some of the surgeons out there saying, hey, we don't have to do amputations. We don't have to do these things. And you cost yourself money by doing the right medicine. Then you start knowing that's not a charlatan.
It's all about what your values are, right? Because at that point, and I learned a lot from you, Tro, when we had you on. I think there are some benefits of the NHS system, although it primarily runs on the same principles, which is drug people to death and follow guidelines. It's not quite as corrupt as maybe the American system's become, where, from what you've said, there's been kind of basically reverse takeovers of the hospitals and then general practice by the industry. We're not quite there, but there's we all feel the same. And it's, what did you come into a medical profession to do? It wasn't to drug people, right? It was to do some good and to feel, yes, you need a living, but you want to get some satisfaction from your professional practice. And I tell you something, that this gives me so much more satisfaction than ever dispensing ever did.
Well, so I think that's also very critical. There's so much burnout. Most people go into medicine for that satisfaction, and along the way, they throw enough money at you that you just forget about it, or you decide to ignore it, and then but that's what's leading to burnout. They're not. We're certainly not getting paid enough to disregard our values. Let's put it that way. And maybe there's no price to disregard our values. Right. And
there isn't for me. And I think for not all health professionals, of course, there are health professionals who will ultimately sell out. But, guys like you, your passion comes from the feeling that you're fighting the machine, doesn't it? And that you want to do the best for your patients. And the system is fundamentally upside down and inside out.
Yeah, it is. And people have heard about the system in the US. People have heard about the close, how insurance companies don't necessarily want to decrease the costs. They want a higher cost of care because they make more money. They're able to profit more off that, right? And the hospitals certainly are happy to charge more. And the, pharmaceutical companies are happy to charge more. Everybody's happy to charge more and have people get sicker. They're all incentivized to have people get sicker. how is it in the UK?
Look, I'm not saying, the one thing I don't want to do is come across and as like we've got it completely sussed and the Americans have got it completely wrong, because there's amazing things going on in America. So please don't misinterpret that I think we've got it right and you've got it completely wrong. I think we've got some things more right than the state system, because with a national system, you're probably less prone to some of those pressures. There isn't the reverse takeover, but I do feel, nevertheless, that we're up against the same two fundamental paradigms, which is big food on the one hand, making you sick, and big pharma on the other hand, sort of keeping you just about alive. So I think those fundamental paradigms are there, because we're all taught to eat by what to eat by the food companies, and if you look at the UK so-called healthy eating guidelines, which I followed for 25 years of practice, right? It's all processed food and carbs and diet. They might throw some Diet Coke in there, but it's cornflakes and Weetabix and avoid saturated fat and polyunsaturated, all the rubbish. And if you look at the people who write the guidelines, they don't declare their interest, but Zoe Harcombe has done a fantastic job of not just challenging guidelines, but unveiling the corruption behind the scenes. These people all work for the food industry, right? So the food industry is writing the guidelines, which is making people sick. And then the industry simply has to just pick up the tab, right? Then it's pretty easy for the industry to say, okay, well, you're all sick, so the choice is drugs. They're not going to educate people like you and me that actually the drugs are only a marginal benefit and lifestyle change is where it's at. And nobody else is filling that void except people like you and us and the incredible public health collaboration and low carb Denver. And, that's, I believe we should it's about a social movement for change, isn't it?
Can I talk to you about something? So I want to get your opinion about this. This is Brian, maybe you could chime in too. I met a newly graduated dietitian, graduated, just out of school. And she knows what I've spent the last decade of my life on, and she knows what I've spent my 30 years of my life, aiming towards.
Yeah.
And she's a type 1 patient. She's type 1, she's a dietitian. And I said to her, how do you feel about low carbohydrate diets to tackle metabolic health? How do you feel about these things in type 1, in people with type 2, and people with obesity? And she said to me 3 things, and I want you to hear them. The first thing was the body and the brain need 120 grams of carbs.
Yeah.
And I said,
bullshit. Yeah.
Right? And she said that without carbs, the body won't function. And that whole grains are a complex carb that is healthy.
Yeah.
And when I said, what would happen to somebody's brain if they had less than that? She said, well, they'll use fat for fuel. And I said, is that a bad thing? She goes, well, not exactly. It's like, it sounds like it's a good thing.
Yeah.
And, anyway, bottom line, I asked her, I was like, you support low carb diets. You have type 1. How do you feel about it? She says, I don't support those types of fad diets. Yeah. And I asked her, I said, well, you've made some statements here. And I said, I'm going to disagree with you. It's like, can you go find me the evidence to support your statement? 120 grams, the body and brain needs it. But, and I know she saw my social media posts because she was very upset about it, when they went viral 2 days ago. But it wasn't a knock on her. It had nothing to do with her. This had to do with the fact that she was just educated and she walked out of her education and this was what she got. So, and she's a bright, young, nice lady. And, she's passionate. She wants to tackle, disease. So Graham and Brian, I'd love to also hear your thoughts. What is the problem here? What is the problem? Because you understand it, but the listener that's listening, they don't understand it. They don't understand how that person ends up saying those things. So what do you think's the problem?
Look, guilty, right? and I bet you were guilty. How long have you been practicing in the way that you're currently practicing? And how long did you practice in the old way previously?
Yeah, I mean, I spent 30 years trying to not be obese, and then about 10 of those, just less than 10 of those, you being very low carbohydrate and intermittent fasting and focusing on metabolic health.
Yeah. So what occurs to me, right? I mean, I think the overwhelming majority of medical professions are decent people trying to do their best, right? I don't believe that most medical professions are evil and, corrupt. It's the system, isn't it? So it's a bit like gravity, right? I mean, if you claim it, saying that low carb, high saturated fat diet is a bit like claiming, like being a flat earther, right? Everyone's going to laugh at you. It's ridiculous, right? Everyone knows the earth isn't flat, just like everyone knows that carbs are lower in calories and it's calories in, right? We're all inculcated in this false paradigm which confuses the difference between physics and biology. And it's, I think possibly pharmacy less so, but medicine is very hierarchical. So if all your senior peers tell you something, it's pretty hard to challenge the paradigm, isn't it? I mean, we all have, but it's a painful process. And it's even more of a painful process to think, well, I practiced for 20 years this way. Maybe I've done more harm than good. That's coming to terms with that is pretty difficult. So what do you think, Brian? Do you disagree with that? Or
yeah, I think that's the problem is I think in medicine, in pharmacy, we're rule followers. So if someone tells you this is the rule, you follow the rule, you do the rule, you don't step outside the line. And so when you say I'm following the rules, it's not working. Like all of us have experienced gaining weight, doing exactly what they told us to do. And we know what we're doing. And like, this isn't working. So do I keep doing it? That's the definition of insanity. Is somebody go, let me try something else. And then it works. You go, oh, my favorite patients are the ones that said, hey, I tried this wasn't working. So I pulled this lever. Then I'm changing this. This doesn't seem to work for me. I had a great discussion with one of my favorite patients this morning. And she said, this, and this weren't working for me. So I did this. And guess what? It's working. So it's not working. Keep doing the same thing over and over. You say, okay, what lever can I pull? But I think in medicine, it's such a scary place to step outside. And like you brought up, my biggest education has been watching people like Professor Tim Noakes get attacked. You go, he's just telling people not to eat cereal. And he gets attacked like crazy to say eat real food. And, Gary, Fedke, and you go, these guys went under. When I saw that, I thought, wow, they're just telling people to eat something different. So, you don't see the vegans, even if they don't have data, getting attacked like that. And you don't see certain people getting attacked, but you see people like Sean Baker getting death threats all the time. And you go, wow, that is just, it really has become a religion to some degree. And I see it all the time. Someone will post a picture of what they're having for lunch and like 30 people will criticize and say, oh, you have vegetables on there, you're not carnivore, or you have this, you don't have, you have a glass of wine, you're a terrible person. It's like, oh my gosh, let that person. Brian Wiley's been doing a good job of posting stuff. Look, I have this sometimes, big deal. Who cares? Let the person do what they want to do if it's working for them. So I think it's that we get so militant and so in medicine. I think the hardest thing, and this, I've thought about this a lot. People cannot say, oh, I was wrong. Right. So I tell people all the time now, I was like, remember when I told you if you skip breakfast, you go into starvation mode? And like, I never had data for that. That's just what I was told. And you have to eat 6 times a day. And then, so what I do is I would say, okay, nutritionist, put on this CGM and wear it for a week and do what you're doing. And then we'll see what your numbers look like. And I know what they're going to look like. And then you kind of get a convert. So I think what you're doing too, is to give people the data and again, people don't have to be the sharpest tax and they don't have to understand physiology. All they have to do is put on that CGM. And they say, ooh, when I eat this thing, my sugar goes to 280. If I don't eat that, it stays at 100. I feel a lot better and I feel better. And I'm not hungry all day. And when people can see it themselves, it's like, hey, don't take my word for it. See what you see. And I think that's what you're doing. And that's what we're all doing, is saying, let's give the patient data and let's work together as a team.
I agree with all of that. And I guess when you look at what Gary, and I've had both Gary and Tim on my podcast, when you look at what they were put through by vested interest and their own professional bodies, where they almost lost their license to practice. I mean, they've both survived it, but I'm sure that it's aged them by 10 years each of them. And at a certain point, you think, well, if it's going to be like that, you've got to be pretty determined and confident to take the system on. And I think that what Tim did, what Gary did, when you look at all the people that Ansel Keys historically flattened, right? If you read the history, you'll know this. There was lots of dissonant voices to the things that Ansel Keys was saying, right? Not least Yudkin. And yet they were all flattened and destroyed. So this system broaches no alternative. You're not allowed to have an alternative narrative. You're not allowed to challenge. And when you understand the fundamental of science, science is all about challenging, right? So back at Flat Earth, I'm entitled to argue the case that the Earth is flat, right? And you would say to me, okay, bring forth your evidence that the Earth is flat. I'll bring my evidence that the Earth is round, and we'll see where we end up, right? And I'll look completely ridiculous, but I'm entitled to make the argument, right? In the case of statins or LDL cholesterol or anything, we're not even allowed to voice a dissenting opinion because we just get destroyed. It's incredible.
Or whatever it may be. I think over the last 3 years, we've all learned like stuff that was said was not true. And we said, it's not true. That's not what I'm seeing in my practice. I have to base on what I am actually seeing, not what I'm told I'm seeing, but what I'm actually seeing. And the people who did that have I live in California. I don't know if you know the condition out here, but if I speak against what the governor believes and the medical board of California believes as the standard, you could lose your medical license. You can be under investigation for the next 10 years and lose your livelihood, lose your family, lose your house. By saying, hey, here's what I'm seeing, guys. I don't know, like prove me wrong or prove me right. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. And that's and that's how medicine evolved. What you did is you saw this one patient get better and you say, okay, let me apply that to other people and see if it's still works. Maybe it was just he's the one person on earth that works for. But when you see it happening for 50 people and then 150 people, then you say, wow, there's something to this. And that's what the SMHP and all these, when you could say, look, let's say the standard is broken and we have to fix that. Yeah. Diabetes is our number one killer. When you look at, all cause mortality and everything going on, you go, okay, we got to attack this problem. If we keep doing the same thing that's not working, we're never going to get out from this.
Yeah. And you have to have hope, don't you? I mean, to me, this is completely like with David Unwin. Like David and I think, are the same age. And it's a very similar, he was really burnt out and he was going to give up medicine, right? Now he's loving it. And I feel the same. I'm not practicing pharmacy in any conventional way, but I tell you, it's completely reinvigorated my practice. I can't practice the old way though now. I literally can't. It's impossible.
So what does it look like? How does a patient find you? And then what is your approach? What does it look and feel like? How do they, do they come meet with you only? Is there a team behind you? Can you help me understand what it feels like across the pond?
Yeah. So the majority, I thought we'd end up recruiting the majority of our clients through the pharmacies. So we make that offer in the pharmacies. We've got television screens and, our pharmacies are not your average pharmacy, right? So we've got robots doing dispensing. We've got technicians doing dispensing, and we've got pharmacists who are independent prescribers like Corey, who was, I had Corey on the podcast. I don't know if you've kept in touch with Corey, but.
Oh, Corey is hilarious.
Corey James.
Yeah, Corey James.
Oh, yeah. He's doing great stuff. Yeah.
So again, in the UK, pharmacists actually prescribing is relatively, it's not the norm, but it's quite common, much more so than the States. So it means that our scope of practice can go much, much more broad. And also in the UK, I got involved in inventing something called Healthy Living Pharmacy. So we're quite known for our public health intervention, smoking cessation, sexual health. It's kind of stopped there, and I'm very keen to move it into weight management, and not weight management using Wegovy, right? Weight management using low carb and reversing metabolic syndrome. So you could kind of see the direction of travel. But the overwhelming majority of my clients come to me through social media. So we've got, I can't, take my hat off to you guys. I don't know how many million downloads you've had now, Tro, but we're not kind of up there with you, but the principle's the same. So we've got an active YouTube channel. We've got an active Facebook group. I do lots of blogs and I do lots of public talking as well. And that's my favorite. My favorite thing is actually talking in a room to real people. I get so much more buzz from that than doing, although it's very convenient to do stuff over Zoom and we couldn't do what we're doing, right? But I love
That's amazing.
Groups of people.
That's amazing. And the question and answer and all that, when you could really just sit down and go, okay, here's the deal. Here's what's happening.
That's my favorite.
Amazing.
So by those different means, we've gradually built up a following, and it's interesting how many pharmacists have contacted me. I mean, I'm keeping in touch with Corey. We're like brothers now. And one thing that pharmacists do know is we know things like numbers need to treat and numbers need to harm. And we're pretty well aware of the true benefits and the true side effects of drugs, right? So pharmacists are generally quite skeptical about drugs. And certainly in the UK, almost the majority of GP practices now have a pharmacist attached to the practice, not dispensing, but managing the prescriptions, the prescribing systems, making sure that people are treated to target, making sure that, the bloods have been correctly done and all that's correlated. So you could kind of see how you got the kernel of something that could really be quite different. But anyway, coming back to your question, Tro, I kind of got off the subject a bit. Yeah, people find us through social media overwhelmingly.
And Graham, you're outside the NHS? Are you is it like cash pay people come to you? How's that work?
Yeah. So the majority of my income, I mean, the Prolongevity service wouldn't stand alone. The majority of my income still comes from the pharmacies, and that's very much NHS. Like 95% of our income is NHS. But Prolongevity is a private service. Now, I'd like to get to the point where the NHS might commission it. So we're trying to scale it using apps and AI, but also we're hoping to start a PhD next year. And over the next 2 or 3 years, collect sufficient, like you guys have published. We want to get to the point where we can show the NHS published data and say, well, you're investing all this money in PCSK9 inhibitors or whatever it might be this week. What about some de-prescribing? And here's some evidence. And, I'd love this to become a national service in the way that Healthy Living Pharmacy already has.
So what is the process for that? I know you're actively part of, the public health collaboration. So, help me understand how these type of programs become accepted in the NHS system and in that public, what do they need to say, hey, we're going to pay you for this because we see the value?
Yeah, I think it needs the kind of stuff that you're doing, Tro, because, you've started with case studies, and then the case studies have become publications, and then the publications get amplified. And I think we all work together. So this becomes an international collaboration of evidence-based medicine, right? Rather than just eminence-based medicine or vested interest-based medicine. And, you know the work David Unwin's done. And now he's not the only GP. David Oliver, who's also been on my podcast, he's probably a few years behind David Unwin. But if we can start to get a group of practitioners UK-wide and international, and I'm very keen to involve pharmacists in this because both the criticism that you aim at the medical profession, I believe, is equally valid at the nursing profession and the pharmacy profession. So on the one hand, we can't absolve ourselves of responsibility here, but also if all of us can work together, we can really build something. And I think if we get sufficient evidence base, it's already trickling away, right? So in the NHS now, you can say the words low carb without having your head shot off, right? It is within, we have NICE guidance. This is our national guidance. And it's beginning to change. The paradigm is starting to shift. The walls of power are starting to crumble. Why is that? Because we can see the benefit for patients. We can see that you've got much happier professionals. you can, David Unwin has collated the data of the amount of prescribing he's not now doing. And the prescribing, of course, is just the tip of the iceberg. The prescribing, I think their underspend is about £50,000 relative to the other practice in the area. But if you start to collect that and you collect outcome data and fewer visits to the GP and fewer hospitalizations, right? We're not looking at £50,000, we're looking at millions and trillions of pounds potentially. So I think that's the process, and certainly within the public health collaboration, we're hoping to be the glue, if you like, that holds all this stuff together, brings together people in a safe space, gives the ability to amplify what we're all doing in our little N equals one, and starts to create a national movement. And also equalizes things. One of the things I like about the public health collaboration, it's not hierarchical. Whether you're a health professional or a patient, there's no difference in your status as a human being, right? And this whole humanistic approach. And I think, I'm optimistic. I think things are beginning to change.
Yeah, I think it's a slow change and it's happening. And people, when they get results, they start talking to each other. And, it's funny because I was thinking, like, who wouldn't be happy about what you're talking about? And the only one I can think of is pharma and big food, because it attacks both of them. And we all said they're the pillars of what we're up against in healthcare, because they're providing the education. So you say, gosh, darn it, how do you get these doctors who, like you talked about your dietitian, Tro? It's like, she has in her brain that that's the only way to do it. And you got to be crazy to go against saying, hey, you're going to, like, how many people have had like brain failure from not eating 120 grams of carbohydrates a day, right? I mean, and our body can make carbohydrates. We know that because we see it on our CGMs. So haven't had people, the sugars go low with fasting. They go higher a lot of times, right? So it's just amazing. And I've seen people when they're at full out exercise with a CGM on and their sugars go crazy high and they have to shoot extra insulin to bring the sugars back down. So to make these arguments, I think at this point, it's hard to argue the science and the data we see. Is like, okay, this person runs and their sugar goes to 180. How much carb do they need to load on top of that 180? That just doesn't make any sense.
Back at your type 1 diabetic dietitian, Tro, I'd give her a copy of Dr. Bernstein's book.
So I politely said, I just want to let you know, the Institute of Medicine says carbohydrates are not an essential macronutrient. And I said, I'd love for you to find the evidence behind your statements. And she said she's going to. So she said she's going to. And hopefully I can be, compassionate enough to understand her issue. And I think her issue is trusting our educators. And trusting
absolutely,
right? And that's a problem. It is very clear that she cannot trust. And you mentioned the dilemma of flat Earth, and that may be the other extreme of not trusting the science. So you become too nihilistic. It's like all of a sudden you're in magical thinking, But I want to come back. It's trusting authority.
Yes.
Authority. And so at some point you embraced not listening to authority. And here you are talking about LDL, and here you are talking about, and I went through similar changes myself.
Yeah. So
I think the problem, and you guys tell me if I'm wrong, it's our trusting authority, right? It can't be done. In science, it can't be done. You must verify. We must teach students.
And you have to question. You have to question and go, wait a minute, this isn't working.
You mentioned
let me just throw in a plug. Dr. Unwin, there's old doc about to retire, sitting in the middle of nowhere. And so you're saying this one doctor knows more than the ADA, the American Heart Association, all this stuff. There's one old doc out here around sheep. He knows better than they do. And then he shows his data and you go, oh my gosh. I mean, he impacted all of us to say, this guy has experience, he understands it, and he wants to help people. So when you start understanding and you see, I mean, for me, this last 3 years has been the most eye-opening time of my life, probably, of saying, oh, this is how it works. Like, who's paying the FDA? Who's paying this? Where's the money coming from? You go, oh my gosh, like, how can this how can we all be regulating our friends? And it's like me and Tro say, okay, Tro says it's true and I say it's true, so it has to be true. It's like, well, it doesn't mean that. You could both be wrong and you could be paying each other. So, you know, to see the conflict of interest in medicine has been astounding to me. It is just, I mean, it's like, you can't believe. When I first heard it, I go, there's no way this could be true. And you start looking and say, yeah, that's where the funding's coming from. Okay. Like, look at the medical journals and how, you know, what their advertising is and what they're doing. And all the commercials that are on TV go, wow, it's really amazing, because I'm not going to have someone sponsor the podcast and then talk bad about their product. Right.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Can I tell you? So I think when I hired, so I was looking for really inspiring people to work with, and Dr. Laura Buchanan and Dr. Matt Calkins are like 100% those people. I'm so grateful that they've agreed to take this sort of, to come work together with me. But the first thing I said, I remember to Dr. Laura, was like, you better challenge everything you see. Yeah. Don't take anything here for a grain of salt. I could be wrong. Yeah. You better challenge everything you see. And that's what you did. Were you always like that, is my question.
I think you are, when you're a child, you challenge everything. When you go through a professional qualification, you get all this knowledge, but I think you're taught not to challenge, right? You're taught this is the official received view, and you'd have to be a heretic and be burnt at the stake to challenge it. And I think it's trained out of you. And, you know, Robert Lustig said the same. I think he'd done an undergraduate degree in nutrition and then went on to study medicine, and everything he knew all of a sudden was just left to one side because it was trained out of him. And you've got to be a particular sort of person, haven't you, to practice in a particular way for 20 years and then think maybe I've got it completely wrong. That's really hard to deal with, isn't it? Because you haven't deliberately been doing it wrong for 20 years. I won all these awards. What could I have done wrong? You know, and now I realize it's hard. It's really hard to contemplate the fact that maybe everything you've done is misguided and that you've been lied to. And it's really discomforting, I think, because once you start to challenge some of it, you wonder if the whole world is going to cave in, right? Because if statins are a lie, does that mean everything's a lie? Where does the lie begin and end? And that's, you know, it's very destabilizing.
Yeah, you could either have more awards on your wall or you could help more people. That's what I learned too. You know, I was voted top doc, you know, one of the top docs in San Diego for like 12 years in a row. I went low carb and then I'm no longer one of the top docs, and I've helped way more people after that, like way more effective. And, you know, I've sat down and helped people go through life crisis and all these things. And it's like, I'm way more effective, no question about it. But you're 100%. Not in the establishment anymore. So if you're not part of the establishment, you get kicked to the side. So it's those things like, do you need an award? I don't give a crap about that. It's like that patient that I can help and what Tro's doing and what you're doing. We all kind of have that same mentality. It's like, if I can't help people, I think that the sad part about medicine, and this is what the conclusion is, that, you know, a lot of these doctors have 8 minutes per patient. How are you going to help them? You know, so we're going to have to pull in pharmacists. We're going to have nurse practitioners and PAs. You go to the ER now, you're not going to see an MD. I mean, it's very rare. I mean, they're a small percentage. You know, your odds are you're not going to see an MD, because the system knows, hey, we'll get people that will take less money and we can work them harder, and they're going to be part of the system. And so the burnout rate among physicians, I just interviewed a physician, ER doc for a lot of years. She goes, I can't go on like this. It's insane. Yeah. Because now I look back and go, gosh darn it, all these problems could have been prevented before they got to me. Now it's like the whole ship has holes in it. And now I'm trying to fix all these holes. Like, gosh, we could have prevented these holes in the first place if you allow the hole not to rust, you know?
I was listening to that podcast with Matt, and I've forgotten the name of the other doctor you've taken on recently, Tro, but he was talking about, you know, wading into the river and fishing people out, and try at least some of them don't drown. And I use that analogy a lot, which is go to the top of the river and find out why are people falling in the first place. And I just think there's a fundamental problem with medicine, which is, you know, it's something I've discussed a lot with Chris Kenobi, right? If you look back in history, there was no there was basically cardiologists were unknown because there was no heart disease in, 120 years ago. There was dementia was virtually unknown. Type 2 diabetes was virtually unknown. It was there, but incredibly rare. Autoimmune diseases were almost unknown. And yet everyone believes, well, that's because people died because they were too young. They died young and they didn't develop the diseases. And that's bullshit too. It was, people did live into their 70s and 80s in smaller numbers, admittedly, because they didn't die in childbirth and they didn't die, in the first 5 years of life. But one of the things I've learned is that the life expectancy of a 20-year-old 100 years ago was pretty much the same as the life expectancy of a 20-year-old today. Because by that stage, you hadn't died in childbirth or child infection, and you hadn't been killed in some famine. So and you were probably eating a species appropriate diet.
Maybe less stress, and you're sleeping. You don't have all the all this crazy processed food we have. You have to look at the big picture and not just zoom in on one thing and go, oh, it's because we're driving more cars. Well, that's probably not influencing that much. So it's really been a great discussion. I appreciate what you're doing, and I'm really excited about that. I think that's a model that we have to copy in the West and get people more focused on saying, let's get rid of all these meds. And I'll tell you, as a pharmacist, some people have been told, you'll never come off this medicine. Don't let anyone take you off this medicine once you go on it. And then it's like, you're on this other medicine for the side effect for the first one that you haven't needed for the last 30 years. And then you start seeing this whole craziness that we're dealing with. And you're the experts on drug interactions and all these other problems. And you think, and as a pharmacist, I see it where, primary care, we just go, here's an antibiotic. You have a sniffle, it's a cold, it's a viral illness, and everyone gets an antibiotic because that's what they expect. And so
here's a suggestion then, guys. Your next team member, don't add another physician. I'm not knocking your physicians. Find yourself a low carb pharmacist like Corey. You'll make a big difference to your practice. I think you'll be surprised.
I would love that. We just got to be able to, what we need? Me and Brian need somebody to come in and give us like $3 or $5 million in funding, and then we can do a lot. And and that may not be too far from the truth. So.
But even now, when we can collaborate, like I just met with Temple Stewart this morning. It's like you have someone who understands. You have a dietitian, you have a psychologist, you have exercise physiology. You have different people who understand different aspects of what that need is, and some people are going to need one of us more than the other. But we have to be able to, it's frustrating from their perspective. She's like, I can't get an insulin on people. How do I know where they are metabolically? And a lot of the doctors refuse. So people are consulting me just because they go, my doctor won't get an A1C or insulin. Guess what? You have diabetes. And they're refusing to get an A1C. Are you kidding me? This is craziness. So I think it's that. And I think it's just part of it's doctors don't have the time to educate. So if you can't educate, then we need to bring in a pharmacist or a nurse practitioner or a PA or someone who can spend that time with the patient to teach them. Even if we do it Zoom, I mean, what we do with the podcast, Tro, is just so amazing. How many people we've reached across the world that go, oh, let me try it, and they got better
across all platforms. I think we're approaching 10 million, Brian.
Fantastic. Yeah. The other thing that's worked really well for us is we've got practitioners who are basically associates. So I've got somebody who's an expert in cardiac rehab, and she's got a psychology degree. I've got another low carb pharmacist. So we've got other practitioners that may not be immediately part of our practice, but they spend time with our clients where we need them. So that it's not just Graham, right? It can't just be Graham. A, I'm too busy, and B, I don't have all those skills. So we have got a kind of a loosely outsourced team. So if we need to bring somebody in with particular skills, we do that. And I've also got good contacts in secondary care. So I've got a low carb endocrinologist that I can refer people to, because I know where, I know what I know my knowns and my unknown knowns. I'm quite good at that. We've got a low carb cardiologist that we can refer to and get a CAC score. So actually it's quite broad and deep what we can offer people.
Amazing. And when we all work together and don't fight each other, we can get a lot accomplished. There's no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And learn from each other, not censor and shut each other down. Learn and go, okay, well, when I first heard about Corey, I was like, what? Pharmacists are doing med stuff? It's like, who's better to de-prescribe? who understands the physiology and all that. Most doctors don't understand the physiology of the stuff. When what we've been through, I mean, it's just shocking. It's like, were you not in school? Like, did you not learn this? Like, there's certain things that are just foundational that everyone forgot about for 3 years. And you're like, wow, this is amazing. So anyways, I think it's just nice to have people who understand physiology and human nature, and realizing it's not just the drugs, it's not just keto, it's not just, this big picture. And what you said earlier, and I was laughing when you said it, you were talking about hope. That's what Dr. Unwin brings. When I talked about hope on this podcast, I got attacked for 3 days. One time, because like, how can you have hope during the pandemic? I'm like, well, it's going to get better, right? Here we are. None of us are wearing masks right now. We're talking, we're engaging. But, I mean, when you're going through it, it's some people, if people have hope, then they can do something about it. When you say we can reverse this disease, we can get you off your diabetes medicines. Yeah, I have 20 people that came off blood pressure meds. Then they have hope. If I say, well, you have a chronic progressive disease, it's never going to get better. All we can do is manage it. Well, that sucks. No one wants to hear that. We have cancer. We can't do anything about it. Good luck. I mean, no one wants to hear that.
And the other one that's really, I've learned a lot recently is from Georgia Reed and Chris Palmer. And all of this, the twin effect of cardiometabolic health and mental health.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the biggest thing. Tro and I took heat for that too. So yeah, it's a critical thing. I know he has patients and I got patients too. But hey, one more time, how do people track you down if they want to find you, Graham?
Yeah. So can I just say one thing? Just use
absolutely
your podcast as a platform.
You want to talk about Tro?
He's an international collaboration of pharmacists. So if there are any pharmacists watching who are interested in this, please contact me, because we need to work together and work with our medical and our nursing colleagues. So the best way to contact me, we've got a Facebook group. Just search the word Prolongevity, longevity with pro in front of it, and you'll find me. Or my Twitter handle which is at Graham S. Phillips, GrahamSPhillips.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. Great discussion. I really appreciate having you on. Sorry, everyone, Tro had to bow out early. We could talk bad about him for a couple of minutes, but Graham actually likes the guy. They connected and they're doing good.
I mean, Tro was great on the podcast, and I've been following him for a while. And he tells it as he sees it, and that's no bad thing. And it comes from passionate care about his patients. And if you're going to fault someone for that, then I'm sorry, you're pretty mixed up, I think.
Yeah, anyone who knows him knows his heart and his drive and what he's doing. He's doing a lot of great work. He's got a lot of great research. He's kind of saying, hey, look, you want me to prove it to you? Here you go. Here's another study. Here's no more data. And anecdotes only go so far, and then we have to have data. And so, and that's what I love about what you're doing, is saying, let's try. What we're doing is not working. Let's change it a little bit. Let's see what we can get figured out, and that's
100%.
It's an amazing thing when we learn from each other and grow from there, what we can do. And I want to take a second and thank our Patreon supporters. Like Tro is saying, 10 million downloads. That's insane. And it's really because of you. I want to be forking out the money every month to do this. So when we all kind of pitch in, we're helping people, we're bringing people together. There's a lot of great things that have been done through this podcast. A lot of things have been birthed out of it. So the Patreon supporters, we owe you a huge debt of gratitude that you kept us going. We didn't have to have someone from pharma sponsor us, or whoever had the most money. We've kept it pure, and hopefully our message comes through that way. And you allow us to stay, as open-minded as we can, and not be, having to be bowing down to someone's, saying, we want you to talk about this, or we want this done. You can't touch this topic. So having that has been great, and we get to have great people on like Graham and learn from each other, and hopefully save medicine. Hope our help each other.
And can I just say at the end that I think you're both an inspiration, and I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, people like you and Tro, David Unwin, Tim Noakes, and so on. Fantastic, and please keep doing what you're doing. It's so important.
Oh, thank you. And we feel the same. There's so many great people who took a stand and did the right thing. And so, hey, let's make things a little bit better. And I think that's what we're all doing as we work together. We figure this thing out together. So thank you.
All right. Take care.